Hello there, and we are at BKC Moscow conference, and I have a guest of honor here, John Hurd, the plenary speaker of the conference. And not just plenary, like how many talks do you give?
I gave 2 workshops today and 1 more workshop tomorrow.
And a plenary?
Not a plenary tomorrow.
Yes, but today there was a plenary
and 2 workshops
and 1.
Yeah, so 4 sessions in total.
A day, yeah?
That's 3 in one day, which is kind of enough for one day, I think.
Yeah, like a real marathon runner.
Kind of, yes.
You have to have endurance.
But I'm okay. I got to the end. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would like to introduce you to those who don't know you yet. Mm-hmm. So John is a teacher trainer and materials writer living in Oxford. And he teaches on some of the courses at Oxford University, of course. Mm-hmm. Frequently gives teacher training talks and workshop on a range of ELT topics at conferences and other events both in the UK and abroad. Mm-hmm. And actually when I'm speaking about abroad, the 3 lines of names of countries. Yeah?
I think maybe the last count was over 30 countries. But
30?
Around 30, I think.
Wow,
Yeah,
so it's really all around the world. Yeah.
Mainly Europe, but also other places as well, but it's largely Europe, yes.
Yeah, and John has written or co-written a number of grammar books, course books, teachers' books, and the most recent being Language Hub by Macmillan. Mm-hmm. Just came out recently.
Yes, I think the first 3 levels were published last year in the summer, and the 3 more levels have just been published literally this month or last month, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also you contributed to Keynote Proficiency Workbook and some many others.
Yes, and little bits and bobs of various other books, Navigate and among other things, yes. Mm-hmm.
Most interestingly, well for me however, for example, is that you're an expert on dyslexia. It's such a rare thing really that, well, someone really has...
Yeah, I wouldn't describe myself as an expert on dyslexia. I know about dyslexia. I know quite a bit about dyslexia. I talk about dyslexia. I adapt material for dyslexic learners. But an expert, I'd sort of maybe distance myself from being an expert.
All right,
depending what you mean by expert.
You know the things about dyslexia, yes. And what part of our conversation we're going to address dyslexia in our interview as well. And also, in your free time, you play drums.
I do.
Yeah, and this is what we discussed.
We've been talking about drums and drummers. And we have some common ground. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's one of my favourite things, playing the drums.
Yeah.
I'm happiest when I'm behind my drum kit, I think. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, but I'm not a very good drummer, I have to say. I try.
And I would like to thank very much to BKC IH conference for providing us with this opportunity to talk and have this interview. All right, so let's start with the first question. So your plenary talk was called Do You Speak 2020? So about language change, about what's going on in language. And I'd like to start with this provocative question. Is English going to the dogs?
That's a very good question. That's a very interesting question, and I guess it depends what you mean by going to the dogs, but I would say no. Going to the dogs is something pretty terminal and pretty serious, so it's not. It's changing, like a lot of languages are changing. Those would say that we are kind of losing something. People, there is resistance to language change, and in my plenary at the beginning, we talked about how going back to the time of Jonathan Swift and the 1500s and the 1600s, before then, there was resistance to change. So, yes, I personally don't think it's going to the dogs. I think it's never been healthier. And I think all this
Never
change,
been healthier? Wow, why?
Because I think again, as I said in my plenary, I think I quoted Diane Larson-Freeman, a nice little succinct quote saying, if I can paraphrase it, saying that basically we, the users of English, are sort of responsible for changes in the English language, which I think is a very healthy thing. Some changes stick and stay, some changes come and go, but I think it's in a healthy state. It's sort of languages in the hands of the users of the language, which I think is a good thing, on the whole.
Yeah.
So,
what can you say to people who are worried that all these internet communication, texting, shortening of words like, do they really spoil the language, or that people cannot learn the correct way anymore?
Like most things, there are pros and cons. It depends on your perspective. I think a lot of social media use, text use, Facebook messaging is very creative. I mean, you know, we have so many emojis now.
Yeah.
And a carefully chosen emoji can, they say a picture paints 1,000 words. A carefully chosen emoji can, you know, save yourself a whole paragraph of explanations.
Yeah, enhances a lot. Yeah,
yes, you know, we kind of use emojis in two ways, and you know, they can just sort of illustrate the language, or they can actually help with an interpretation of the language, depending on how you use them, and I think that's very interesting. But back to the language, all this shorthand, this creative spelling, we'll have to see what happens to the language. But I think it's a good thing. I think, you know, people have been creative with it, and it's you know, I think it's exciting. You know, it's interesting. It's dynamic.
Yeah, indeed, it's very dynamic. It's because of there are so many users of English, because of so many non-native speakers.
Sure, but non-native speakers, it's their language as much as it's the native speaker's language. You know. So no, I think it's great. I think you know, the fluidity and the change, but the pace of change compared to previous decades and centuries is incredible, thanks to the internet. As I mentioned in my talk this morning, you know, somebody could maybe coin a phrase or use something, and it's gone around the world within seconds and minutes. You know, some of these things stick and some don't. But you know, with today's prescriptive texting, etc., this shorthand, the classic SMS text language, see you later, you know, with the C and the letter A, that's kind of come and gone. Vestiges of it still exist, but this classic text language that was the thing 10 years ago, 15 years ago, now that we've got more predictive text, that's kind of disappearing a little bit. Some of them have stayed. You are you, I still do, are you, and you are, etc. But I think the see you laters have kind of come and gone, I think. And that's what happens, language comes and it goes, and what's exciting, you never know what's going to stay and what's going to disappear.
For those of you who haven't watched your talk, can you maybe point out 2 or 3 tendencies where language is developing now?
Well, my talk was called Aspects of Contemporary English because there is so many things we could talk about, and I had an hour just to choose a few areas. The way things are changing, one area I talk about was non-standard grammar, this idea that it's prescriptively, technically maybe not correct, but so many people use it, we have to kind of accept it. Some of these non-standard grammars might become the norm. So we looked at less and fewer, for example, and the idea is, I know Michael Swan in his Cambridge English course basically said using less.
You mean Oxford?
Oxford English course. Sorry, yes, the Oxford English course, yes. I do apologise to Oxford and to Michael Lewis and to Cambridge. The Oxford English course, Swan and Walter's Oxford English course, he goes as far as saying less is correct. You know, he's very prescriptive about it. You know, less. He gives the example in his book, less problems, which to me sounds a little bit
still, you know,
but he goes as far as saying it is correct. So that's one example, and there are lots of other examples of language change. In my talk, I also talked about new uses of old words, teen speak. Teen speak is very interesting, that some words stay. A lot of words, when too many people are using them, they lose their exclusivity, it's no longer part of the gang. The kiss of death is when an adult starts to say the language, and then it disappears. Chillax. Everyone was chillaxing, which is a portmanteau of chill and relax. Chillax was a thing 10 or so years ago. One day it appeared on an advert on TV in the UK with 2 20-something adults, and one of them told the other one to chillax, and that was the kiss of death. No teenager wanted to use chillax anymore, and that's something that came and went. And talking of portmanteaus, where you put 2 words together, like the traditional ones like motel and brunch, that's something that's very of the moment as well. And I mentioned in my talk, it has there's a lot of it in advertising and marketing. It's snappy, it enables you to combine 2 ideas into one in an efficient way. It's creative. so that's another thing that I think is very interesting. We've had it for a long time. I think in my talk I said brunch goes back to the very late 1800s. But this is something that's very of the moment, I think.
Oh, thank you. Let's move on to the next area of our conversation. So, one more of your talks takes into consideration the level of processing and grammar. Yeah, and your talk is called "Take Advantage of Your Students." Yeah? And well, again, for those who are not familiar with this concept of levels of processing, so can you just explain briefly what it is, and just again without giving out too much? Just a couple of things.
Sure. I mean, my talk, Take Advantage of Your Students. The idea is your students are a great resource in the classroom. Use them as a resource. Hence, take advantage of your students. And the idea is, I mean, I think it's now pretty well established that if you're personally engaged with the language, it's more meaningful. You're more likely to remember it. If we go back to 1972, Craig and Lockhart, and they're not applicable to the English language classroom, but they weren't specifically applicable to that, but we can think about it in terms of learning English. You know, they came out with this kind of new idea that it's not where and how you store information that's key to remembering, it's how you process it. And they basically say the more meaningful and the more engaging the language is, the deeper you process it. The deeper you process it, the more likely you are to remember it. And that was a seminal paper in 1972, and that kind of still holds today.
Yeah, I read it in relation to vocabulary development.
Yes.
So I learned the concept from, I think it was Paul Nation's book that I read it. But how does it work with grammar?
Well, I think essentially vocabulary grammar, you know, if you're engaged with the language and you're using it more meaningfully, and it's basically deeper cognitive processing, you're going to remember it more, whether it's a little piece of grammar or a collocation or an individual vocabulary item. I think broadly the process is the same. The more you're engaged, the more you're likely to remember it.
Yeah, can you probably give one or two examples of activities that increase or deepen this level of processing?
There's something that it's a very simple, and it was quite maybe not revolutionary, but a new approach to teaching grammar. Not that long ago, maybe 20 years ago, the idea that instead of having just these focus on form activities, the activity can, as simultaneously as possible, focus on both form and meaning, and meaningful meaning, so that your grammar exercise, say for example, could be in the form of a question. So not only do you the form manipulation, you then can work together asking and answering the question, just to make it meaningful. So it gives a reason for looking at the form, and you need the form to express meaning. So
is it like communicative task, what we usually call a communicative task, personalization?
So let's say, for example, something that's in my talk from the new Language Hub book is, it's vocabulary connected with money and the use of prepositions: spend on, in cash, by card, and so on and so on. So quite simply, I've just constructed an exercise where you have to put in the prepositions, but the sentences are questions that the learners can at the same time ask and answer with each other. It's quite a simple, straightforward
So it's a gap fill, but with some communicative component that they have to...
So instead of just doing a focus on form, then bye-bye, and then a different exercise, you can use the same exercise for the focus on form and the communicative, meaningful engagement, which hopefully, getting back to what I said, if you're more engaged with it, you're processing that a little bit more deeply. It's a tried and tested methodology, relatively new. It's probably only 20 years ago that started becoming the norm.
You mean the norm? The tasks have become the norm, or they started to talk about this level of processing?
No, I mean these kind of tasks. I think a lot of course books, but when if we go back 20 years, when I was involved in the beginning of Inside Out, that was quite a new, different approach.
Oh, really?
I'm not saying they were the first book to use it, but they were the book that really kind of put it on the map, and a lot of since then, quite rightly, followed suit. So You know, so that's, for example, what I mean by take advantage of your students. You know, you can constrict your practice so the student can engage with it, interact with it on a meaningful level.
Yeah, and do you have like just one extended practice instead of just doing 3 separate?
Well, you could. I mean, it depends. I mean, you could just do the one exercise, or then you could then do a different exercise to practice the same language. But the point is, the focus on form doesn't just focus on form. Ideally, you can do that. That can be your workbook exercises, your homework, your extra practice. But you know, I think it just gives reason for doing the focus on form if you can then use it in some way.
Right. And moving on to the final one of your 4 talks, you have a talk on speaking activities.
Sure.
As far as I understand, it also takes into account the planning stage of a speaking activity, and it's mostly about planning. Why is it so important to plan it, and what are the best ways of planning?
Well, this was the talk I did today, and the main focus is on the planning. So at the beginning of the talk, we just do a little bit of looking at different speaking activities, just to set the scene. Why planning? Well, this was actually the subject of my master's research. And over the years, 20, 30 years, pre-task planning has been studied by academics. As you know, behind coursebook methodology and classroom methodology, there is a lot of sort of academic research going back over a long time on which the methodology, the coursebook methodology is based. Over the years, there's been a lot of research that says if you plan a task, you're more fluent, you attempt more complex language. My research showed or suggested, of course it's not conclusive, suggested that you also can be more accurate if you plan. And basically it's sort of grounded in Lavelt's theory of speech processing, the idea you have your conceptualization stage, which is when you think of your propositional content, what do you want to say? Then you have the sort of coding stage where you code that into language, how do I say this? And then you have your articulation. And broadly speaking, when you plan, you kind of get the propositional content out of the way. So the planning allows you to think, what do I want to say? So that when you speak, you can attend to the linguistic content. You can basically focus not on what and how. You've already got the what, you can focus on the how.
On how.
Consequently, you're more fluent, and my little bit of research suggested you're also more accurate if you're focusing on how to say it rather than having to divide between what and how. That's a broad summary.
You plan sort of ideas, you plan what you want to say, the content.
So for example, it might be, okay, in the classroom I want you to talk about a film that you like. Instead of just saying go, talk, I may give you a minute or two to think what you want to say. It's as simple as that. Or some of the exercises we looked at, I'll give you some prompts. When did you see it? Who did you go with? What's it about? Is the music memorable? Etc. And you will just look at these prompts to give you some ideas of the propositional content. What? And you literally just maybe spend a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes thinking of what to say before you say. And a lot of research has been a sort of people who've been able to plan like that versus, well, not versus, the control people who haven't planned. Talk about a film, go. And all this research, very deep, you know, research has basically shown, yes, if you plan, you're more fluent, you're more, you attempt more complex language, which is a good thing, which itself is good for helping to develop language. The actual process of planning has been shown to help you develop your interlanguage. Even if when you articulate it, you may get it wrong, just the process of thinking about it in the planning stage helps to develop your language. So there's a lot going on when you plan. It's very interesting. And that's basically what my talk was about. Activities that just with an inbuilt planning stage.
Thank you.